When we talk about language, especially the language used by those who hold gender critical beliefs, we need to ask the question, who has the power over language? Obviously, all you need to do is look at George Orwell's 1984 to be reminded that the power of language holds a certain fascination for us. We are used to our language being framed and reframed, and ultimately when you have groups such as Sex Matters, the LGBT Alliance, and other gender critical groups who seek to reframe trans womanhood as something that is just simply being trans identifying men, or using the term trans woman without space in it, they're trying to co-opt and claim a certain definition of womanhood that has never historically been there. You only need to look at the morass of social media, such as on X or Facebook or certain sections of Reddit, to see just how incipient this language has actually become. And at its core is this Catholic natural law philosophy, as exemplified by people like Michael Foran, which seeks to reduce women down to their core component parts, namely natality, this idea that all a woman is her gametes. You only need to look at J.K. Rowling's social media output to see just how pernicious this is. If you go through any of her posts and you put comments on her posts, you will see quickly that certain bots, certain automated processes will immediately flood your replies with comments structured around this philosophical approach to gender and language, which I don't think even gender critics themselves are necessarily aware of. You only need to look at The Transsexual Empire, written by Janice Raymond at the end of the 1970s, to see where gender critics get their language from. It is rooted in this idea that womanhood can be framed from the flesh and blood, from the genetics, from the material you are conceived with, rather than what is in your mind. Indeed, any attempts from trans people or their allies to reframe the conversation around choice, around bodily autonomy, around this idea that womanhood is not a prison trapping you, invariably lead gender critics back to the womb, to half, and to gametes. Indeed, it's that gamete-based argument that has become so predominant in the conversation that both the UK and the US Supreme Courts decided that womanhood is only for those who were assigned female at birth and have XX chromosomes. They deny every other conception of womanhood. Indeed, they say that womanhood is this circumscribed place that you can never enter or exit. And this harms all women. This doesn't just impact trans women, it doesn't just impact cis women. It impacts any woman because it means that women's bodies are being policed within an inch of their lives. Single mothers were policed back in the 70s and 80s, not the feckless fathers who abandoned their families, not the men who chose to reject their children. It was the women who got castigated by the state. The same goes for any woman who seeks to get an abortion. You only need to look at the rhetoric put out by groups such as the Heritage Foundation, Alternative for Deutschland, even the UK Reform Party. They are coming for women's rights, and trans rights are simply an extension of this because they see trans women as the lever through which they can then police single-sex spaces, sports, and any other aspect of life where being a woman is deemed the use of that space. And it's very telling that as soon as you push back on it, as soon as you push back on the purifying language that they're using, you get attacked, you get called a PDF, you get called a whole range of names. Because ultimately, It's not about defending women's rights, it's about defending patriarchy. It is about defending the simple construct that men have created and men want to reimpose. You only need to look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition of womanhood to see that woman is not this fast, rigid structure that gender critics claim it to be. Indeed, woman has always meant the antonym of man, the weaker sex, the sex that is to be dominated. So crossing that divide between man and woman, whether you're a cis man, a trans woman, if you act as a woman, you are seen as something lesser. And historically, it has been trans men who have tried to enter the realm of manhood who've had their bodies policed. You only need to read Mannion's Female Husbands to see just how heavily society policed the body of trans men. And this is why when gender critics say trans men are the victims of patriarchy, they ignore the extensive history of trans men since the printing press was invented. It's telling that when they start attacking trans women as predators in waiting, the language invariably pitches trans men as victims of this whole process. So when they talk about womanhood, when they talk about the language used to defenestrate trans rights from this great house of rights that have been constructed since 1945, what they're doing is saying that only their version of language ought to be the language that is used. I would go as far as to say that the language being used to deconstruct trans women is already rebounding back onto women's bodies. You see this in the abortion arguments, you see this in reduction of benefits, you see this in the dehumanising of any woman who is not deemed woman enough. I would take this a step further and say this is going back to the language the National Socialists used in 1930s Germany. This is the language used in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is the language used to suppress first-wave feminists. Indeed, it is entirely the language used to keep women in their place because women were seen as weaker, they were seen as infants, they were seen as immature, requiring men to stand sentinel over them, because ultimately women were seen as legal children throughout their entire adult lives. And this is why feminism was so essential, why feminism is so essential, why trans women belong as part of womanhood, because trans women have historically, and even up to this day, readily accepted everything that being a woman in society demands. Trans women are not expecting special status. Indeed, they are walking away from patriarchy. They are walking away from the privileges that gender critics claim they have. They willingly embrace womanhood because that is who they are. That is the very core concept of how they see themselves. And by falling back to this Catholic natural law dogma at the heart of gender criticism, gender critics are essentially saying, well, actually all women are the gametes and the flesh and blood that they always have been. It's very reductive, and ultimately it's not a constructive process. There is nothing constructive about gender critical language. There is nothing positive about the world that gender critics are building. And you only need to look at the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission's guidance that came out at the end of May 2026 to see that it is women's bodies that are being policed. They don't care about men. You don't see the same arguments about men being afraid of trans men entering male spaces. You only see the same reductive language about womanhood being used again and again and again. And ultimately, the only people who benefit from this are the same ones who set up these patriarchal structures to begin with. And for all of the gender critics who are going to complain and say, well, you're just a man. Well, no. I'm not a man. I never have been. And honestly, it misunderstands what womanhood actually is. Because women have the bodily autonomy and the right to self-determination to go, I am a woman. I claim ownership of my body. Or not. If you're a trans man or you're a non-binary person or you're intersex, you've got every right to opt out of whichever definition of womanhood is being imposed on you by society. Womanhood is not a prison. It never has been, and it never should be, because ultimately, womanhood should be a liberatory experience. And feminism should be about tearing down the house, should be about tearing down the strictures that bind women, not simply buttressing them and reinforcing them through reductive conceptions of womanhood. And honestly, any woman who buys into gender criticism needs to have a hard look in the mirror and says, is this how I wish to be perceived by the world? Is my reproductive potential all the language that I'm going to be bound by? Because every time you speak to a gender critic, every time you listen to their language, there's no joy there, there's no happiness there, there's no, actually, I understand and I acknowledge that I'm a woman because I want to be a woman. It simply falls back down to this birthright that says, I'm a woman because, well, I was defined as a girl and that's how I grew up and therefore I'm a woman because I had a girl childhood. Is that enough to be a woman? Is that what they are satisfied with in their conception of womanhood? And I would suggest to you, next time a gender critic says, I'm a woman because I have large gametes, just go, well, that's what men have been telling women since they docked, since patriarchy was established, since matriarchies were disestablished. Because ultimately, it only benefits men when women are framed through the gametes that they potentially could produce. It reduces woman, the global concept, to womb, hearth, and labour. And to quote Paris Paloma, we have to have a coming to the high table moment. The head of that high table needs to recognise that the labour that we produce as women doesn't matter if you are trans or cis. What matters is that you're a woman, and how you came to your womanhood, whether it be when you turned 16, whether it be when you turned 18, whether it be when you turned the moment you transitioned. Ultimately, womanhood is not this prison binding women to it. It is something that is self-understood, because a woman is somebody who understands herself to be a woman. And that is liberatory. That is the point why the Catholic natural law dogma underpinning gender critical beliefs is such a flawed assumption, because gender critics are only interested in catching the crumbs from the head of that high table. They're not interested in emancipation. They're not interested in liberation. They solely want to keep women at the foot of that table, not as a queen at the head of that table. And that is why you never see gender critics coming out pro-abortion. You never see them in support of immigrant women. You never see them supporting women on welfare, women on social security, women on benefits. You never see them championing single mothers, because ultimately their conception of womanhood is rooted in the money they're receiving. It's rooted in this reductive idea all a woman is good for is hearth, home and womb. And that is why we need to fight back against gender critical philosophical beliefs, because they harm all women, not just trans women.